Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We're within a few videos of reaching the conclusion of the series, The Man Who Made the Beatles, and it's been quite an adventure. In the last episode, we learned even more about Brian and his feelings regarding the Beatles' business and his NEMS business. Brian didn't like the contract that wasn't a lifelong one with the Beatles. He knew they were older and wiser, and he was willing to go down in the percentage of the profits he would make with them. If they weren't going to tour, he could just be their personal manager, and he would like that. Next, he had a crazy idea of letting Robert Stigwood merge his company with NEMS. Needless to say, no one in NEMS' business was happy about it, and pretty soon Brian wasn't happy about it either. Now we're going to see what happens today. Despite all odds, Brian remained capable of handling important and successful business activities. It was because he had a work ethic instilled by his family. With NEMS having a new look with Robert Stigwood joining the company, he flew with Vic Lewis to New York on February 27, 1967, and got the right to present concerts in Britain that summer by the Monkees. And the Monkees were television's version of the Beatles. While Brian was there, he arranged a first New York visit by Cream. He scheduled them to play with The Who during the Murray the K's concert week at RKO Theatre, and he began negotiation for another British tour for the Four Tops. He was on top of things for promotional tactics. He chaired a press conference that surprised New York media at 10 a.m. at Mac's Kansas City Club. He spoke of his company's new interests in Cream, The Who, the Bee Gees. His face turned red when the media people cared more about him than in his sales talk about unknown pop groups. When Brian got back to the Waldorf Tower suite, he faced an angry Nat Weiss. Brian had started taking barbiturates. Nat told him, "Don't take those things." Weiss said he took too many. He became really nasty and very aggressive. When Brian's assistant Peter Brown returned after spending money to an extent Epstein didn't approve, he got angry. Weiss said Brian took the change, threw it in Peter's face, and said, "You're fired, Peter, and I want you to go back to London immediately, economy class." The next day, Weiss got involved and cooled down the fight. The outburst had been caused by Brian's suggestion of drugs. Weiss had wrestled Brian to the floor of the hotel suite, forcing a bottle out of his hand, and he threw pills out the window. While Brian was in New York, he was celebrating. He spent Sunday nights at Lou Chow's restaurant on 14th Street, enjoying conversations with strangers across the tables, and dining regularly at Quo Vadis, La Caravelle, the Chaperon, or Manger Ali. Eating out was never spontaneous. The restaurant was carefully selected. Often Brian had a chauffeured limo ride around Manhattan and Central Park, with Brian smoking filter-tip marijuana from a cigarette case full of ready-rolled joints. It was a favorite pastime. Weiss said Brian never rolled his own joints. He wouldn't know how to begin. Brian could not even fold an envelope. During his rides, Brian would ask for the same song to be placed on repeat from the music system. The song was from the Four Tops. It's the same old song. Brian's redeeming qualities, which became legacy to his artists, were his caring kindness, generosity of spirit. When John Lydon was in Great Yarmouth supervising a dress rehearsal for a series of concerts starring Jerry and the Pacemaker and others, Brian suddenly discovered that Cilla was unhappy with the routine surrounding her show at Blackpool. Brian phoned his production director from London. "You must go to Cilla in Blackpool tomorrow. Cilla is unhappy." An airplane had been arranged by Brian to fly London over that afternoon. Lydon said he was busy, but Brian said his flying visit for Cilla was essential. So Lydon flew north for a few hours, and then he reassured Brian by phone at the stage door at Blackpool and said Cilla was happy and saying he was returning home. Lydon said that if Cilla was unhappy, or any of his artists, then out of his pocket he would have taken the last 10 quid to make sure that they weren't. That is what was so lovely about him. It therefore wounded Brian's pride and ego and severely dented his emotional vulnerability when Cilla became the most difficult of his artists at the time of his weakest physical state. Debbie Gendler, one of the Beatles' American Fan Club secretaries, said you could tell Brian really cared for Cilla Black. She said that Brian beamed with pride as he watched, arms folded, as Cilla performed in the Persian Room of New York's Plaza Hotel. But the empty seats proved what many business insiders feared. The prestigious venue was far too sophisticated for Cilla, who was scarcely known in America. and planning for Cilla to be in America, he made a mistake. Yet Cilla articulated her recognition of what Brian achieved. I wouldn't have got to the top without him, she told BBC Television's Panorama. Because I come from Liverpool, nobody wanted to know Liverpudlians. It was a handicap because of the way we spoke. But Brian began having problems with Cilla in the autumn of 1966. During a demanding period with his health threatened and his working pattern notoriously unsynchronized with his artist diaries, Brian had been strangely neglectful of the girl singer he admired and loved, and this became apparent when on November the 3rd, Cilla opened alongside Frankie Howerd in the revue Way Out in Piccadilly at the Prince of Wales Theatre. Where he once would have visited the show at least once a week, Brian's visits after opening night became sporadic. A whole month went by without his appearance. Only a year before, Brian himself would have considered this a heinous crime. Cilla felt ignored during the show's 9-month run and saw Brian's absence as a crushing insult at a stage in her career when she was full of youthful self-importance. Says Cilla now, "It's terrible regret to me that he did not tell me more about his depressions because I could have been a bit more understanding. In those days I was full of what's happening to me. I was so very young." Cilla and her husband Bobby also resented their treatment at the NEMS office because their requests to speak to Brian were diverted to others. The old interaction was gone with so many non-Liverpudlians now on Brian's roster of artists. They felt deprived of the old family atmosphere. Cilla said, "We all thought Brian was the Superman. Suddenly we discovered he was vulnerable, and it was quite a shock." Cilla decided it was time to leave Brian. Her husband Bobby phoned Brian with that decision. Brian was distraught. He knew he had been inattentive and that Joanne had stonewalled them on the phone many times. Epstein immediately invited them to lunch at Chapel Street. There he explained he had been under pressure and was also unwell. "We went on the roof garden of the house, and he broke down," recalled Cilla. "He said, 'Please don't leave me. Don't do this. Think again.' Cilla and Bobby wept too, when a tearful Brian said, 'There are only 5 people in the world I care about other than my family, the Beatles and you. Please don't leave me, Cilla.' And she hugged him. Epstein felt she had previously shown a lack of compassion about his problems. Now he knew that she had no true conception that he had any. Cilla said, "So how could I leave a fellow who said that? He did not make any excuse. He said he was on top of everything at his work, and we decided to give it another go." When Brian was with Cilla, his secretary noticed he had a look of benign affection. The only day it deserted him was on that day. Cilla felt neglected by Brian, said Joanne. Robert Stigwood had called her about something and she went off her nut. She only ever wanted to discuss her work with one person, Brian. And Brian was terribly fraught about this, but by the time they came down from the roof garden, they were all smiles. He'd weathered the storm. Cilla reflected that it was wrong not to accept the fact that Brian had to delegate some of his work. Being totally naive and very selfish, I didn't put 2 and 2 together. I said enough's enough. There was no row, and she was joining the long list of people close to Brian who realized, from his daily behavior, that inside the man of calm charm was a complex figure of lonely vulnerability. How many other managers or showbiz agents would show such genuine emotion, unlinked to money, over a relationship with one of their acts? When Brian indulged more frequently in narcotics and admitted it to the media, Cilla was one of the few artists in whom he later confided. The Cilla episode left Brian feeling heartache. Brian rarely allowed the world to know of any internal strife. But backstage at the New Musical Express poll winners concert at Wembley, Brian met Tito Burns, then manager of Dusty Springfield. The 2 men exchanged pleasantries, but Burns noticed that Brian came out of Cilla's dressing room looking white. He said he was having a hard time. Brian joked, "I'll do a swap with you. You give me Dusty and I'll give you Cilla." Tito said, "Thank you, Brian, but I like the way Dusty sings." Neither the Beatles nor his closest staff experienced Brian's daily condition as clearly as Nat Weiss. Brian spoke to him every day. One midsummer's day in 1967, Brian and the songwriter Lionel Bart saw each other at the psychedelic clothes shop Granny Takes a Trip in Kings Road, Chelsea. They had been friends since meeting in Liverpool 3 years earlier. Epstein had been a fan of Bart's work since the days when he ran the NEMS record store. Lionel's talent for writing music for the theater in shows like Oliver and also Cliff Richard's early pop hit Livin' Doll was to Brian the perfect, brilliant marriage of his own twin interests. That day in Chelsea, both were with other company. They nodded to each other. Bart bought some cowboy shirts, and Brian indulged in his favorite apparel of the period, psychedelically patterned shirts. Bart said, "I look like a ragamuffin, stoned out of my mind." We did not talk. We both knew we were both wrecked and on the road to nowhere. It wasn't until Brian moved to London that they became close. Their friendship centered on a group of entertainment figures who met regularly at the home of singer Alma Coogan. She was a singer with an infectious laugh in her voice and wore flamboyant dresses, which Brian loved. She was famous in show business circles as much for her gregariousness as for her successful singing career. Brian's friendship with Alma was one of the enduring connections he made. She was forceful, imaginative, naturally enthusiastic woman who loved her show business life. Brian admired the theatrical flair deep inside her. They socialized and spoke by phone extensively, and when they were seen together, they seemed like a couple destined to be together. In the book, there's an asterisk at the bottom of the page that said that Alma Coogan died, age 34, of cancer, October 26, 1966. Brian, who had only intermittent contact with her in the preceding months because of his world travel schedule, was morose at the loss of one of his closest friends. Then we get back to the story they were telling. Bill Harry firmly believed it was a permanent, significant relationship. They looked so right for each other. I thought they were going to get married. I thought he's fallen in love. Isn't that great? They had a common sophistication that was absolutely fantastic. Virginia Harry said they were unarguably together. Sandra Carson said that Alma was a very finely attuned, mystical person, and she thought Brian was too. Alma went to his house many times and was bemused by his collection of hundreds of suits. They spoke often on the phone, and Brian valued Alma's thoughts on everything, on many things. Alma was a headstrong woman, difficult to cajole, and Epstein was one of the few men she would have wanted to manage her career. He could never do that. He had long ago made the pact with himself that the only girl singer he would manage was Cilla. But Brian's attraction to Alma was so special that he took her to Liverpool and introduced her to his parents. He sent her postcards whenever he traveled. He brought her a gift from each trip. Alma's extrovert, bubbling personality and keen interest in clothes struck a chord in him. And if Brian was ever to have married, Alma seemed the perfect partner. Brian and Alma's affection for each other was never to be clouded with the talk of his homosexuality. That was swept under the mat. And then they talk about Brian and Lionel Bart were also close. They went on holiday together in Spain, and when they went away independently, they exchanged holiday gifts. Bart and Brian also experimented together with drugs. Lionel Bart said the flower power thing was happening. He said Brian and I felt it was necessary to be a part of it in many ways. We had to be in touch with what was going on in the world of pop music. You could say we were emotionally immature, but it was a courageous thing for that man to do. He and I were experimenting, trying to find something good in life, but using oneself as a test tube. We all did it together occasionally. Brian was attracted to drugs partially as a means of relaxation and of extending his perception as he believed it, and also to experience how the Beatles were changing. Bart said that he was into meditation with the Maharishi 3 years before the Beatles were. We were all trying to find a universal theme to touch the world with, and in a way, during Brian's lifetime, it came off. Brian couldn't hide his use of drugs from his staff. He didn't want to hear it when they said he should take care of himself. Early in 1967, he was medically advised to get more rest, and he got the idea of buying a country home. It was Kingsley Hill at Warpleton near Heathfield in Sussex, and it cost £25,000. It was a modest country home with sunken fireplaces, sweeping drive, spacious gardens, and a cottage atmosphere. It would be a regular weekend retreat, one that Brian hoped would help get him back into better health. While buying it, he stayed with Jeffrey Ellis at the home of his lawyer, David Jacobs, at 2 Princess Crescent, Hove. While Jacobs completed the purchase, Brian started to buy antiques, furniture, and kitchen equipment from shops in nearby Brighton. Brian's behavior, though, worried even Jeffrey Ellis. Sometimes in meetings with accountants, he wasn't making any sense. He would latch on to a relatively unimportant point and make a terrible scene about it, shouting and screaming. He couldn't seem to grasp the whole course of the meeting, which led Ellis to assume that Brian's irrational behavior was caused by his being under some external influence. His staff became frantic for his attention. John Linden, who was the production director, needed immediate decisions and would find important appointments suddenly canceled by a phone call from Brian. And Tony Barrow, under pressure from printers to authorize artwork for concert programs, waited for days past deadlines for Brian's approval. They learned the quickest way to get a response from Chapel Street was to send memos to Brian with two alternatives. Either I don't hear from you at midday on a certain date, I will assume it is all right to go ahead, or, more increasingly, an option box at the foot of his mounting internal mail. Yes, no, let's discuss, please tick as appropriate. Having to do this showed Brian's unreliability, yet Brian was confident that careful use of drugs was inseparable from the cultural stage on which he played a leading role. In the Times London paper dated July 24, 1967, there was a full-page advertisement headline, "The law against marijuana is immoral in principle and unworkable in practice." There were 64 prominent names calling for the government to encourage research into all aspects of cannabis use, including its medical applications. They asked that cannabis should be taken off the dangerous drugs list and controlled rather than prohibited, that possession of cannabis or allowing cannabis to be smoked on private premises should have their sentences commuted. And Brian signed it, as did all four Beatles using their MBE appendages. Brian told Melody Maker, "I really believe that pot, marijuana, or hash, whatever you like to call it, is less harmful without question than alcohol." On the question of whether suppliers of marijuana would try to turn their customers onto heroin and cocaine, Brian said the laws governing soft drugs principally create the danger. But the danger exists already with alcoholics who turn to hard drugs. I think, however, that the danger is remote in the present context. None of the people I know who smoke pot are interested in harder drugs. They are certainly aware of the dangers involved. He said he had been apprehensive that he might become addicted, but I took that risk. But then I am in no way addicted to alcohol and seldom smoke cigarettes. Brian admitted that he tried LSD 6 times from mid-1966 until the end of his life. He felt the effect was profound. He said that LSD lessened his ego. Brian said, "I certainly didn't feel I wanted to fly or jump off a ledge. I've never had a hangover from smoking pot or taking LSD. I think LSD helped me to know myself better, and I think it helped me to become less bad-tempered. The bad thing was that it eliminated the necessity to compete," Lionel Bart said, "and that was no good for a businessman like Brian." So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, we saw two sides of Brian. One was that he was still able to be effective as a businessman, and the other side of him was that he was being drugged down by his drug use. He wasn't available to answer important questions regarding the business. It led him to almost losing one of his most important artists, Cilla Black. They were able to settle things when Brian expressed his emotions towards Cilla, and she forgave him. Brian then got a countryside home to help him relax and put his signature on a full-page advertisement for letting marijuana be legal. He admitted to taking LSD and said it made him feel less bad-tempered. Lionel Bart said it also took away his necessity to compete, and that was bad for a businessman. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And as I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page, and if you purchase anything, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon to the Beatles Forever. Thank you.